So far, we've looked at decision making almost from the perspective that it's just an individual working in isolation making decisions. But it's much more common that we would actually be making decisions in groups. So, in an organizational setting, it could be that you've got one manager working with their team to make a decision, and that manager might have the ultimate responsibility for the outcomes of that decision or implementing that decision. You may have team meetings where different managers come together. So say if there's different departments within an organization, you might have all those different managers come together to make shared decisions for the overall company. And then at the upper levels of an organization, you may have groups like the board of a company who are responsible for the overall leadership and management from the top kind of helicopter view of the organization, and they may come together in order to make decisions. And so there's a lot of different advantages and disadvantages to making decisions as a group, as opposed to being able to make them as an individual. And so if you're a solopreneur operating on your own, maybe you're running your own small business, you're often going to have to make decisions on your own. But as your organization grows, you might start to have more people around you that you can bring into the decision-making process. Or you might be working in collaboration with others and making decisions around projects that you're collaborating on together. Or you may find yourself working in an organization and having that more hierarchical decision-making approach. So even at any of those different levels, we can bring in others to work with us on making those decisions. So some of the key advantages of a group making a decision as opposed to an individual are, first of all, we're going to have more diverse and complete information. And diversity in groups is, generally speaking, been found to be very good for decision making because of those different perspectives and different types of information that come in as a consequence of diversity. And we then get a more complete picture and a more layers of information that we can contribute to the actual formulation of our decision as well. Our groups tend to also generate more alternatives. So if we're looking for our solutions and trying to understand what alternatives might be available, so which choices do we have available to us, groups will often be able to, one, identify more options and also come up with new ones and new alternatives to the problem that we're trying to solve. They also tend to increase the acceptance of a decision because, generally speaking, if you come out of a meeting and you say, okay, all the leadership team have got together, or us as a team have got together and nutted out this issue and we've made this decision, you've got a greater degree of consensus there than if you go off on your own, make a decision, top down. The group then just has to live with it and deal with it. They haven't had any contribution to that decision making, so they're going to be much less more invested in the outcome of the decision, and possibly have less appreciation for the nuances that might have gone into why that decision was made. And I'm sure you've all been in that experience where you're kind of like, why did they make this decision? This is crazy. But from the perspective of the decision maker or makers, there probably was a logic to it that is just invisible to you because you weren't in the room at the time. And so as a consequence of that as well, you have decisions that have more legitimacy because, again, if you're a team member and you understand that this decision wasn't just made by one person, but that there was a team of people who made that decision, it will tend to be, generally speaking, seem like a better decision was made that had more thought put into it and has, generally speaking, a better level of credibility within the organisation. But we do have some disadvantages. So making decisions in a group is obviously much more time consuming than someone doing it on their own. Although it can be more efficient because if you've ever tried to make a hard decision on your own, it's often very easy to get stuck. Whereas if you've got a group of people who can each bring their contribution to that issue or that decision that needs to be made, sometimes it actually can be more efficient. So it can go either way, but generally speaking, for a fairly simple decision that needs to be made, or for one that is very complex, bringing in all the different players into making a group decision can make it a lot more time consuming. The other thing that can happen, and again, I'm sure you've all experienced this, is where you're with a group of people and you're trying to make a decision or discuss an issue or something that needs to be resolved. And there's someone who just dominates the conversation, or perhaps there's a cluster of people who have a very strong view on the issue, or they might think they have the solution that everyone should agree with, and they just start to dominate that whole discussion. And then you might have others as well who are less interested in being exposed. You know, they might not feel comfortable necessarily in this kind of group setting. They might be a bit more reserved, and so that kind of group dynamic might not be quite their cup of tea, and so they will tend to shrink into the background. And so being able to effectively manage all the different personalities and approaches to group consensus and group decision making can be quite tricky. And there are some techniques you can do to try and manage this, which includes things like, you know, inviting people who are not speaking up to actually speak up. Being very aware of whose might be dominating, and maybe getting them to write down what their thoughts are, rather than kind of, you know, being quite effluvious in the meeting and really taking over. And so as a manager, you know, you're kind of going to have to be watching out for this stuff and managing it in the moment as well. Another technique you can use is, using writing. So rather than having a group discussion, people need to actually come in and write down either their solutions or their understanding of the issues before you then get into the discussion about it. So, because part of what happens is that we get our cognitive biases come in. People come in and they've got some kind of confirmation bias. They've got the answer, they know what needs to be done, and then anything else that anyone says, they just dismiss it out of hand. So we've got to be on the watch to manage this as well. The other disadvantage of group decision making is that it actually diffuses the level of responsibility to a degree. And so being able to manage that is important as well, because it can be very easy to just throw your ideas into the ring. And I've certainly been in a lot of groups where this has happened, where people are very happy to participate, their ideas, say what the group should be doing, where we should be headed, all that sort of stuff. And then they walk away at the end and there's no responsibility or action from their part. So you need to also be thinking about this when you've got a group, that the shared ownership and the shared responsibility for the implementation, and if it goes wrong, is also shared, along with their ability to contribute to the idea. And the other thing that then builds on itself, so this pressure to conform, which is a normal feature of humans. When we're in groups, we do feel to some level, all of us feel some pressure to conform to group norms. And that can be a really good thing, because it helps us build a culture together. It helps us get along and get things done. But in extreme forms, it can really contribute to groupthink. And groupthink is, you know, as the name suggests, where we all kind of converge on a similar perspective, and we kind of get stuck there, and we end up in a little bit of an echo chamber where somebody says something and then, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. You're right. You're right. You're right. And we start to get this kind of bias, which is that anyone that thinks outside what the shared perspective of the group is either feels unable to voice it, or they dismiss it themselves because that pressure to conform has taken over. So we do need to be aware of just managing the groupthink. And there's techniques like the 6 thinking hats that enable us to kind of move into different styles of thinking as we're discussing an issue. And we kind of metaphorically wear different hats that put us in the role of like objecting to the decision, or criticizing it, or looking for the downside, or looking for the upside, so that we are getting that balanced approach and starting to avoid the things like groupthink. And so generally speaking, we can think of groups as being more effective if we want accuracy, creativity, and acceptance. So where we've got a decision that is made that has a higher accuracy attached to the information and the outcome of the decision, that is more creative. So, you know, the more people that have ideas, the more we might be able to nuance the decision, and someone might say, well, what if we did this as well as that? Or, yeah, we did that before and this happened, so maybe this time we'll tweak it in this way so that we will avoid that downside. And like I said before, because the group has made the decision, typically more people who it affects have been involved in making it, so there's a higher level of acceptance, but also it means that there's not that sense that, oh, just someone's arbitrarily made this decision on their own, but that there's been a bit of a consensus attached to the decision. But we can generally think that groups are not necessarily more effective if we want a speedy decision. Although, if we need to, groups can often be quite good at both making a decision and implementing it straight away. So in cases where you've got a big problem or something that needs to change very fast, if you can get everyone in the room very clear on what the problem is, how we're going to solve it, you can often get a much more effective implementation than trying to make the decision and then communicate that change downstream to people. And then in terms of the size of a group, we generally think that ideal, we want to work with about 5 to 7 people. It tends to be enough that everyone's voice is able to be heard, and you've got sufficient diversity of opinion. And also having that odd number means that we don't get these deadlocks. You know, and if need be, we can kind of even go to a vote. And then ideally, we don't want to exceed about 15 members in a group, because it just means we start to get too many clusters. There starts to be too many voices, which leads to too much complexity, and then it becomes very difficult to navigate our way through that complexity. And so then the book then offers us a few different techniques that enable us to try and improve group decision making. This is just a few ideas. There are plenty more, and we might even try and play with some in class. But the 3 that the book offers us are brainstorming. So you've probably played with brainstorming before. This is the idea: you just start to generate ideas. And what's really important in a brainstorming process is that we don't have any sort of filtering, which would be critiquing. So if we say, okay, here's our problem, this is the decision that we need to make, what are some options? The idea is that people start throwing in their ideas and just allowing ideas to emerge. And the idea, and what is critical in the initial brainstorming phase, is that we don't have people jumping in and going, oh yeah, but we did that last time, or oh, that sounds really expensive, or oh yeah, that sounds really good, and you know, I'll help you with that. Because again, this is where our biases like confirmation bias and recency bias start to come into play, where the sooner we jump on the first idea and either stomp on it or elevate it, it will actually prevent more ideas coming through. And so the whole idea with brainstorming is that however long you've decided to run the session for, the idea is you want to generate as many ideas as possible. And that often a key principle is that we want to be generating bad ideas, because good ideas can then start to emerge. So just getting them out, many ideas as possible. The nominal group technique is a slightly more methodical one where everyone gets together, but they operate independently. So everyone is going to be having their own say on the issue, critiquing all the different options, and then working towards a consensus at the end. And so that's in particular where we're going to need to be careful to manage the voices of the people in the group, so that we're not going to get too dominant, voices that are more dominant with less dominant voices that may still have good ideas and good advice and information to bring to the decision. We're going to need to make sure that those voices can come through as well. And then the book also talks about this electronic meeting, which sounds a bit like some kind of voting process. It's not something that I've personally ever experienced before. And I don't know, I'd be curious to see what you guys think about this electronic meeting idea. To me, it sounds like a prototype, like an earlier idea around having people meeting online and then voting on things. I think we've probably moved on from that. But certainly the ability to actually use technology to bring people together in terms of, and this will often be the case with organisations that have boards and stuff like that, where the board will be presented with a packet of information before their meeting that helps brief them on the decisions that they need to make, presents them with all the information that can assist them in making that decision. They'll need to then read it and digest it and think about it and potentially talk to people in the lead up to that meeting. And then they will either come together in a room together, or they may meet electronically and then discuss and debate the issues based on the pre-information that they've been delivered. And in larger organizations, so say like shareholder meetings, there may be some kind of voting that's attached to those decisions that get made.